Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Friday night stream. I am Bill, and this evening we're going to talk a little bit about HTML and CSS. And we're not going to get too in the weeds with this one. The purpose of this slide deck is to give a brief overview about what to expect when dealing with HTML and CSS for the first time, as well as a broad overview of how the languages work with each other and with browsers. And of course, that includes desktop and mobile. And I ask that you kindly bear with. I have a new camera set up, however, I am waiting on lights to come in the mail, and so I have a desk lamp to my right, which is just out of frame, and I'm sure it looks not so great at the moment, but the quality of the stream should improve with time, so I appreciate you bearing with. And so to begin with, on this first slide, there is a question that's very common in the UX and the UI community among designers, and that is, why should I care? Why would I care about HTML and CSS? Typically, the reasoning is that a company of a large enough size will typically have, almost always, a team that specifically deals with the front end aspects of a project. Front end being the HTML, CSS, and how it's presented. And so that's sort of the nuts and bolts. The design will be handed off to the front-end team, and then they'll write in language like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, so on and so forth, to bring that design to life so that everyone can use it. And that is, of course, opposed to back-end, which is server administration and some of the back-end languages. And that is, again, usually a separate team from front-end and back-end. Sometimes they're together, and very often those two teams understand each other's languages, so to speak. And so the question is, again, why should I care as a UX designer? If I'm going to be on my own team, with my own people, my other UX UI professionals, what good is it for me to know HTML or CSS? And I would say that the biggest reason would be better communication with the dev team. And quite simply, if you can speak the language, some of the languages of the front-end team, you'll be able to communicate ideas better to them. They'll have, if you need to explain why your design does what it does, or if you need to elaborate on a specific color using a hex value or RGBA, or HSV or anything like that, you'll be able to use that terminology, and the dev team, the front-end dev team, will have a more thorough understanding of what you're talking about. And as I'll try to remember to show this, if you're using Figma, and this could very well be the case in XD and Sketch, however, I have no experience using those softwares at this moment. When you create elements, shapes, frames, so on and so forth, Figma is built on like HTML and CSS. It's a web app, and I'll show you something that Figma has the option to do, and you may not know it, but you're kind of already writing CSS in a way. It's just sort of an abstract way whenever you lay down new layers and shapes and so on and so forth. Another reason why I think that you should care as a UX UI designer about HTML and CSS is, overall, you'll have a better understanding, a more holistic understanding of how web technologies work, how apps work. At the core of many apps, there is a lot of CSS and HTML-like components, if not just HTML and CSS outright. Now, of course, iOS and Android have their own specific languages, of course, and they have developer teams that will develop for one or both of those. However, overall, I think your experience or your time spent online will be enhanced if you understand why things work the way they do. And I am a bit of a evangelist for that way of thinking. And that's not to say, you drive a car, so it would be, at least in my opinion, worthwhile to at least kind of understand in at least a very broad way, how an engine works. What does the transmission do? So on and so forth. By no means am I asking that you become a professional at everything you know about. Just because you drive a car, that doesn't mean you should also be a mechanic or be able to work in a garage, but it would be helpful to, at the very least, know how to change your own oil, even if you choose not to, if you choose to pay someone for that service. And I think that car metaphor sort of run out of gas. However, knowing the, at least on a surface level, the ins and outs of the technologies that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, sometimes for hours every day, will lead to a more, at least in my experience, lead to more fulfilling time while you are interacting with these technologies. And that sort of goes into the third bullet point here. HTML and CSS, they're everywhere. So again, why not be somewhat familiar with something that you deal with all the time? And then this is a huge opinion of mine, and I very much honor other opinions, and I will not I will not fight someone over this. It's just an opinion of mine. With regard to portfolios, the medium is the message, and that is a phrase that Marshall McLuhan came up in, I think, either like the late 70s or the 80s, and he wrote a book about it. And I am thoroughly aware that this says massage, and that is a bit of a joke, and I suggest it would be very useful as a UX UI designer to be at least familiar with the phrase, the medium is the message, and that is a topic for another stream. However, it's a bit of a short read, it's very to the point, and I would suggest at least looking into that, maybe via YouTube. Very important. Continuing on, what do HTML and CSS do? I believe I should have added this to the slide, but HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. So it is a language, and it's there's a bit of controversy about this. Depending on who you ask, they'll have a different opinion. But markup is not code, and that's not a hill I'm willing to die on, and I could be convinced one way or the other. But that's sort of how I'm leading at this point in time. And so whenever I'm putting together an HTML or CSS document, I think to myself, I'm writing markup. I'm composing a document in markup. I never say or think to myself, I'm coding, because I especially would never say that where someone who actually codes could hear me. If I say that to, if I have a friend who's a C++ developer or something along those lines, like works in PHP or Ruby all day, I would never say that because they code. To me, coding, what you write when you code typically needs to be compiled, and HTML doesn't need to be compiled. And so I don't want to be self-aggrandizing, and so I write markup. And it's simple. And when you say that, most of the time, if you're speaking to someone who is in that sphere, they'll know what you're talking about. In any event. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet, but that will come a little bit later. And so I have some columns and rows here that hopefully give an idea of when HTML is used and when CSS is used. And so HTML defines the structure of, and these are just web languages, it defines the structure of a web page, whereas CSS defines the layout and the style. And there's a very often you'll hear people say when they're trying to explain this that HTML is the skeleton and CSS controls hair color, hair length, eye color, all these other things, height, for example. And so you can't, CSS does not live on its own. CSS needs HTML to have any purpose. You can certainly write HTML without any style, but it won't look fantastic. They work together, and of course I'll go into that a little bit in a couple of slides. And as far as the elements, what you will find in each of these types of documents, HTML has the content, such as text, images, things of that nature, links. lists, unordered, ordered lists, and in CSS we'll have elements that dictate style and placement of elements on the viewport, on the screen, on the web page. As far as extensions go, and file extensions are the dot, a couple of letters, like a text file is .txt, for example. Sometime, back in my day, music was .mp3, referred to as an mp3. HTML files end in .html, and of course CSS ends in .css. Sometimes you'll see .scss, and that's a separate but related language to CSS. Very similar, but it's a bit advanced for this discussion. As far as versions are concerned, HTML is currently on HTML5. It seems like there's a new version every 20-ish years, something like that. About a human generation, there's a new iteration of HTML. And I don't exactly remember when HTML5 came out, but I started writing HTML, or I started learning HTML when HTML4 was relatively new, which I think was between 97 and 99 is about the time probably closer to 99 was about the time I started to, practice and learn HTML4. And I'm getting these dates wildly incorrect. CSS, I think, came out around about the same time HTML4 came out. However, it was not widely adopted at that time. The use case wasn't clearly understood, and it took a while it took a little bit of time for CSS to catch on, and now it's everywhere. You never see a web page or a website that doesn't use CSS. It's just unheard of these days. And CSS is currently on version 3. And I'm not sure how frequently they put out new CSS editions, new iterations of CSS. And as far as what HTML and CSS affect, the effect of HTML is, again, what is on the page, what is delivered to the user, what they see when they visit the website. And CSS controls how it looks. And so one is the content and one is the style. That sort of ties together with the first row here. And then lastly, the editor. That is to say, with what application or with what software do we write HTML? Do we write CSS? And that's one of the coolest or best things about HTML and CSS. You can basically write them in anything. And that is to say, you can write them in a plain text editor or a code editor. And code editors are programs that are specifically meant for writing code. You could do document creation, like if you're writing a case study or a short story, you may use an application such as Microsoft Word or Google Docs. If you're using Windows, you might use, and if you don't have access to Office, you might use Notepad, for example, or the equivalent to that in OS X would be TextEdit. And those are perfectly serviceable. Those are okay ways of writing your fiction, your nonfiction, case studies, things of that nature. And you can also write HTML and CSS in there. All you need to do is when you save the file, save it as a .html or .css file instead of, say, .txt. Code editors, on the other hand, are software applications that are specifically meant for writing and editing and reviewing code. And I'll go over a couple of those. And that may sound a bit scary or a bit in the weeds, but they're very accessible. It's true that they are written for developers. This is developer tools. However, they're not that complicated. They can be made very complicated, to be sure. However, Sublime Text, for example, is a very user-friendly, very beginner-friendly code editor, and I use Sublime Text for years. I now use VSC, which of course I'll go over in a little bit here. However, they may look a bit overwhelming when you first open them up, and there's tons of options that sometimes don't make sense. However, they're knowable. You can get comfortable with them very quickly. And I will bang on about this for quite a bit, I reckon. And I would like to really drive home the importance of understanding the difference between HTML and CSS. And this is I sort of drew this rather quickly in Figma, but and I could have added labels, I suppose, but on the left-hand side here, this is what a web page would look like. that was just pure HTML. And perhaps maybe you've seen sites that look like this before. Perhaps there was an issue on the back end, or maybe the server wasn't delivering files correctly that day, and the style was never added to the document. So it only rendered just the HTML. And very frequently, a good way to notice this is if the font is always, or if the font is Times New Roman, then almost always a style was not given to the document, because Times New Roman is fairly played out at this point. However, it is many browsers' default. All browsers have default fonts and colors and styles in place in case the writer or whoever's composing the HTML and the CSS, for whatever reason, they don't add a particular style to something. All browsers have defaults, and the defaults are mostly all the same across every single browser and operating system. And so it's almost exclusively Times New Roman, and links are this pure, the hex value is 0000FF, and they're almost always underlined. And so this is what the exact same HTML would look like, this figure on the right, if style were given to it. And so I believe I changed it to Helvetica. Of course, the font could be changed to anything, of course. And I changed the link style here, which you have to be careful on for accessibility, but that's outside the scope of this live stream at the moment, or in total. And so you can change almost everything. If I wanted to, I could change the line height, the padding, the margin, which is also very useful. I could change, these are just your regular bullets. I could change these to any number of different glyph, or I could have emojis here if I wanted to. So the idea is, again, just to drive this home, CSS is what gives this style. HTML is the content. It's the copy, images, links, so on and so forth. CSS just gives it a specific look. And HTML, and we'll start with HTML first, and then we'll go briefly into CSS, because I don't want to, this could go on for hours and hours quite easily. And I will do a little bit of showing you what writing markup looks like at the end, and a very easy and quick way to get some practice with it, because they make it very easy these days. And I was unsure about how exactly to start this, and I've done some teaching with HTML and CSS before, but it's been a while since I've had to explain it, or that I've chosen to explain it. So I tried to go in an order that made sense to me, that was logical to me. So if this doesn't make sense, I apologize, and of course feel free to ask any questions in the Slack, and I will get to them toot sweet, or every time I remember to look slightly to the right. And speaking of, looks like we do have a bit of a comment right quick. And okay, excellent. I see my man Ethan is checking it out, and Ethan, I appreciate you being with me here this evening. And of course, I'm going over the basics of HTML and CSS, and yeah, I don't know why my typical style is to create a slide deck using Figma when there are better better apps out there for that purpose. But at this point, I can work so fast in Figma that I figure, why not? And yeah, I appreciate the kind remark about the look so far, and I try to maintain that throughout. And there are there are many slides, so I'll try to get through these at a decent pace before we get to the actual live code presentation, or the live markup presentation, excuse me. And to begin with, on HTML. HTML is written using tags, and tags are written like so. You always start with this glyph right here, which of course is the less than symbol, and then you have the element right here, the HTML, and then you have the closing arrow, or which is the greater than symbol. And so whatever is inside these two glyphs, these two symbols, is called a tag. And so you would refer to this as an HTML tag, specifically a starting HTML tag, but that will become clearer in a bit. Semantically, there's a bit of confusion about when to say element and when to say tag, and I surely will confuse this throughout, because of course I'm just freestyling this as I go. I have no teleprompter in front of me. I'm just trying to remember the exact right words to say. When you're speaking about the idea of the HTML tag, not this specific tag, it would be referred to as an element. And again, that's slightly controversial. Different programmers, different people who write markup might have a different interpretation of that. And so if I'm talking about HTML tags in general, I might refer to them as HTML element. However, when I'm specifically speaking about this exact tag, it's a tag. And the way you refer to this tag is it's whatever is inside the greater than, less than, whatever it says here. Like for example, this is HTML, that's how you refer to the tag. So this is an HTML tag. If it said, this doesn't exist, but if it said Ethan inside here, you would call this the Ethan tag, and more broadly, you would call it the Ethan element. In any event, many tags have a start tag and an end tag. And the difference is the end tag, as you can see here, this is the end tag, this is the start tag. The end tag has a // after the less than opening glyph. And so you would differentiate between these two specifically by saying this is the HTML start tag, this is the HTML end tag. And I will warn you, not including an end tag when a start tag is used, that's going to cause problems. The browser isn't that smart, and it doesn't know when you mean to stop if you forget to include an end tag. And so it'll keep on rendering because it assumes that you've written your HTML or your CSS properly. And so that can cause issues. And so most code editors will automatically add an end tag when appropriate. And that's one of the benefits of using a code editor, which of course there's a specific slide on that coming up. And so I will say many tags, this should say most tags. There are, I believe, yes, there are 14 tags without an end, and these are called void tags. And a good example of this is the img, or just call it the image tag. The image tag, there is no /image tag, there's no end tag, so it's called a void tag. That's not a terribly common thing to say, void tag. Maybe among your front-end group you might hear that more often, but you would just call this the image tag, or broadly speaking the image element, but typically the image tag. And so yeah, some tags do not have an ending tag, they're called void tags, and this is the image tag indeed. And there are 14 tags without an end, and some examples of those include BR, which is a line break, HR, which is a horizontal rule, or just a horizontal line that goes across the page. Meta, which is used for certain types of metadata, an attribute and properties would be associated with this tag. And then sources. And you will end up, when you write HTML, you will end up using meta a bit in the head element. And I'll speak more about that. Sources you won't use as much. Of course, this depends on what sort of project you're working on. BR you will use occasionally, depending on how you have your, block level items, padding, and margins set up. And HR is useful sometimes, but not all the time. But in any event, there are 14 total tags that are void tags. Anyway, that's not the most important thing in the world. I just wanted to point out that they exist, and there is a name for them. I had to look it up myself. I didn't know they were called void tags till earlier today. HTML tags that do have a start and an end, they can wrap information. They wrap content. And so, for example, I have the starting H1 tag here, and the ending H1 tag here. The H1 tag is used for large headlines. In fact, H1 is the largest headline. All text inside the H1 tag will be larger and have a greater font weight than normal text. That is to say, it's going to be very large and it's going to be bold. Now, I didn't want to create a separate slide for this, but as far as heading tags are concerned, there are 6 of them. There's H1, H2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. H1, 2, and 3 are the most commonly used in web development. It's not uncommon to see 4, 5, and 6, but the odds of you seeing them decrease the further you go down. And so H1s are used very frequently, as are H2s, typically for subheadings. However, past that, you may or may not see them on a website. And as a side note, each page should have no more than one H1 tag. It is the headline of the page. There's an entirely separate live stream that I plan on doing at some point, speaking on web accessibility, and there's something called a HTML outline, which is a feature that screen readers use. And when you have multiple H1 tags in a single document or a single page, the screen readers don't interpret that very well, and so that can make it difficult for those who use screen readers to navigate your page the way you intend it. So look out for that stream coming soon. And there are three main parts to an HTML document. There's the HTML tag, or HTML element, heading or head, and body. These are the three main parts. These tags tell the web browser how to interpret the information inside these tags. And so each one of these tags, which has a start and an end tag, which of course is the end tag is always the start tag with just a / in front of the first character that's not the less than symbol, and so it would be /HTML, /head, /body. They all have ending tags. And when the browser, so the way the browser reads or interprets HTML is from top to bottom. It doesn't look at it all at once. It starts from the top and goes to the bottom, and that is the order in which it reads. And that's the order in which it delivers content to the page. Now, CSS can switch around the order of things, but you can't, for the sake of this conversation, you can't tell the browser to read in a different direction. From the bottom of the HTML document to the top, it reads from the top down. And each one of these elements has a very specific use, and certain types of content go inside each one of them. And this is the basic structure of an HTML document. And of course, I'm missing all sorts of things that could go in each of these. But if you copy and pasted this into a document, saved it as .html, and opened it up on your computer, it would look fine. The only thing it would say is hello world, which should very much be hello world, and that's what I get for using a spell checker that was not a grammar checker, and I very much apologize for that. However, yeah, if you were to save this and open it, it would display just fine. It would open in a browser and it would look as it's supposed to look, assuming you didn't actually have it say hello world. So I apologize for that. That is my mistake there. And so, as we can see here, you can think of this structure that we have here as similar to what you might see in the layers panel in Figma or XD or possibly Sketch, in that if you'll notice, HTML is this tag right here, the opening HTML, has two more elements inside of it before it stops, before the end HTML tag. It has head in it, and it also has body. Now, if I could have indented these two lines here. Head and body are nested inside of the HTML element, inside this tag and this ending tag here. And so you could think of head and body, these two elements, as being children of the HTML element, which would be the parent. And since head is not nested, well, that wouldn't happen. Since body is not nested inside head, these would be siblings, so to speak. They're on equal footing with regard to hierarchy, but HTML, this element right here, it houses or it contains head and body. The HTML tag informs the browser of the language being used. It will then render the content accordingly. So as I said a moment ago, since the browser reads the language or the markup from top to bottom, when the browser gets to that first line, and the first line of your markup is almost always going to be the start tag for HTML, the browser, not to anthropomorphize the browser, it says, what's coming up is HTML. So I know how to render HTML, and so I'm going to, I'm not going to treat this like PHP. I won't treat it like JavaScript. I know this is HTML, and I know how to put it on the screen the way it's supposed to look. And otherwise, if you don't have these if you don't have the start HTML tag and the end HTML tag, the browser might not know exactly what it's looking at. So this tells it that what you're about to see coming up is HTML. And indeed, any HTML written outside the start HTML tag and the end HTML tag is unlikely to be rendered properly. It might be rendered properly, but it's incredibly unlikely, and it's just bad markup. So you want to make sure all the content is where it's supposed to be in its appropriate area. The head tag is used for metadata, and metadata is not displayed as part of the web page. Anything inside of any content that is inside or is between the starting head tag and the ending head tag is only for the browser's information. It's not going to tell that any of the content here is not going to be displayed on the web page, and it would include information about the metadata is data about something. It's data about data, and so whatever noun is before metadata, it would be, well, I guess HTML would be an adjective in this case, but HTML metadata is data about the HTML, and so it includes information like the title of the document, what styles are, what the cascading style sheet is, or possibly where the cascading style sheet is located if it's an external resource. And it would also include information about what language the web page is in and other things of that nature. And so, for example, this is the title element, and as you can see here, the title element is not a void element, so it has a start tag and an end tag, which is of course title. Some HTML elements, some tags are very semantic, and you can tell what they are by looking at them. Some of them are not at all semantic, and or stand for something that you might not expect, and you'll just get used to that the more you write HTML and CSS. It'll just become secondhand. And I grabbed this screenshot earlier from my browser, and we can see here that in this page, if you were to look at the source or the HTML for just google.com, just their their homepage, index.html, you'll notice at the very top, inside the head, you'll notice the title element, and inside the start title tag and the end title tag, it just says Google. Now they have a very fancy way of doing this, but this is the most simplistic way of thinking about it. And this doesn't end up on the page at all. This ends up actually in the tab, and or just, I guess, the bar itself if you are using an older web browser such as Internet Explorer like 6.0 or something that didn't have tabs at that point. And this little icon right here is called it's F-A-V-I-C-O-N. It's a fave icon or fav icon, but it's fave icon. And I believe it's called fave icon because when you add it to your bookmarks, this is the icon that shows up as well. I just made that up. I'm probably wrong. But this icon, the location of this icon is also specified in the head. You can tell when you're writing your HTML, you can say, and it's part of the metadata, and you would use a meta tag for this if I remember correctly. You would say, hey, this icon is located at, and then you would give the path where it is in another directory or possibly the home directory, and that's how you would make this icon show up. And almost exclusively these days, it's a .svg, it's a vector icon, just so it remains super crisp, and vectors also save a lot of file size compared to a raster graphic, and I went into that more on what I believe is my creating a basic icon in Figma, which I think is still available on VOD if you want to check that out. It's also on Twitch. And so again, head includes metadata. Metadata is content that is not displayed on the web page but tells the browser more information about the web page. Now, the body tag, that's where your content comes in. This is what is rendered on the viewport, and the viewport is sort of a fancy word for the actual web page portion of what you see when you have a browser open. So a browser includes, the URL input field where you can type google.com or any number of things, and there are also buttons on your browser. Each browser is different, but you might have a button on the top of the browser that looks like a bookmark, and you would tap that or click that, and that would add the current page to your bookmarks list. And so that is not part of the viewport. As best as I can remember, the viewport's actually just the page where all the content lives. And so anything that's inside the start tag, the start body tag and the in body tag, that's what's going to be displayed on the screen. Now, of course, CSS can be used to hide certain portions or move content around or hide it at specific points for whatever reason. However, generally speaking, if it's in the body, it's going to be at least eligible to be displayed in the viewport. And so that would include elements such as text, images, links, videos, basically anything the user is going to see or be able to interact with, that's going to be inside the body element. And the HTML documents, they can only have one head and one body. And so a way to think about that is the HTML element is like a person. One head, one body. No mythical beings here. And so, and this is formatted oddly because I didn't have enough space on this slide. Usually I would put a line break between, in this area here, between the end head tag and the open or the starting body tag. But in any event, this would render just fine. Browsers don't care about white space, and so it has a line break right here between the start HTML tag and the start head tag. If there were no space right here, the browser wouldn't care at all. It would not know the difference. It would render the way it's supposed to render. However, you'll notice in this example on the left here, we have the HTML element, a head element, and a body element. That's fine. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's one head, only one head here, start tag, end tag, and start tag, end tag for body, but there's one of them. You need a start and an end for this to be complete, and there's only one head, there's only one body. This is fine. Not so much for this right example. As we can see here, we have two heads, so sort of like not a cyclops, but some mythical two-headed being. This has one head element, and then it has another head element, and so the browser is, depending on what browser you're trying to render this document, this HTML document in, it's going to act funny, and whatever you typed is more than likely not going to come out correct. And so this is not going to fly. You only work with one head element and one body element. All HTML documents start with the starting HTML tag, and at the very end they end with the end HTML tag. Head and body are nested inside, as I discussed earlier, and this is basically the foundation of HTML. And I apologize if I'm mentioning these things over and over. My goal here is to sort of say the same thing in numerous different ways as an approach to give various examples of how these things work, or give various explanations as to how these things work. They all point to the same idea, and so whichever version works best for you, that's why I included multiple explanations of how things work. And so, yeah, this is a better space example to give you an idea of the nesting qualities. And so HTML, the open tag here, end tag here, or start tag here, end tag here. As you can see, head and body are they're nested, or they're not nested, sorry. They are child elements of the HTML element, and they are siblings because they're, one is not a parent or child of the other. And so they're on equal standing, hierarchically speaking. And for what it's worth, head always goes on top of body, just because of the way that browsers, because they go top to bottom, you want your metadata read first and then your body. Otherwise, it would look funny, and I'm not even sure it would render at all. Again, that would be different from browser to browser. Now, this harkens back to one of the slides I was discussing earlier, and that is, how do we write HTML and CSS? What tools do we have at our disposal? Well, one of the best things about writing HTML and CSS is you can basically do it anywhere. And all you need to do is save the document with its appropriate extension. And of course, HTML files are .html and CSS are .css. And if you want to just use the software you have on your computer, not download anything, not do anything special, don't want to go to any certain websites, which I will bring up toward the end here. In Windows, you can use Notepad, and in OS X, you can use TextEdit, and they're basically the same thing. And as you can see here, this is a better screenshot for the TextEdit example. We have test.html, and so TextEdit is, it's a plain text reader. It'll open anything if you want it to. And here in this image, whoever was writing here, they were writing some HTML. And as we can see here, it's a bit difficult. I'll zoom in a bit here. the author of this follows the foundational setup that I discussed in an earlier slide. We start with the HTML start tag, and then we have the head start tag. Inside the head, metadata, we have the title, which is, this is my rudimentary HTML file. And this string of text right here, this is my rudimentary HTML file. That's what's going to appear in the tab of the browser, because that's the title. And then we have the ending head tag, and then we have the start body tag, and you'll notice they're right next to each other. The browser doesn't care. It's going to render this the same way as if there was a line break right here, or white space all over the place. The browser doesn't care, which gives you freedom in how you write your HTML CSS. However, there are some precepts so you'll want to keep in mind, some heuristics when it comes to writing HTML and CSS. You want to keep your code as clean as possible. And aside from that, so inside the body element, we have, here's our friend, the H1 tag. And so it says exciting question mark. I haven't read this ahead of time. It says exciting question mark, and then definitely not. And so how this would render, or how this would look on a web page, is in a big headline font, large text, large font size, and a large font weight. It would be bold. It would say exciting question mark, and then below that it would say in probably 16.16 pixel Times New Roman, it would say definitely not. For what it's worth, and this may be a bit in the weeds, your H1s, H2s, H3s, so on and so forth, your headline elements are, if I remember, they're block level, and so they're going to bump all content to the next line, unless of course you tell them an unless you have a style set up via, that is to say, CSS, that tells them not to do that. But that's one of their default behaviors. And again, all browsers have default values, default styles for every bit of HTML. Every sort of tag has a default style written into the browser, and they're pretty much all the same. And it's kind of a holdover, I guess, from the early days, and it's a good idea that it has defaults baked into the browser, because, for example, if for whatever reason the server, the host, was not delivering content appropriately, and it was able to give the user, or was able to deliver to the user, the HTML file, but then it couldn't deliver the CSS file, it couldn't find it, or something was wrong with it, it's going to render it with all of its defaults, and it's not going to look good. However, it's going to be clear. It's still going to be clear what the hierarchy is, assuming that the HTML is written the way it's supposed to be. And I believe there's an example of that coming up here. And so, I wonder where my images went here. That's awful frustrating. And oh yeah, there's supposed to be an image down there as well. So, let's see what's going on with that there. The trials of doing things live. Let's see here. So, okay. So my frame went away. In any event, there are also special apps for writing code and markup. And these are your code editors, as discussed previously. And two very popular ones, and there are many of them. Some you'll pay for. They require purchase, and some are free. And Sublime Text and VSC, or Visual Studio Code, which is made by Microsoft, these are both free. Now, you can register Sublime Text, and I believe you can give them some money, but you don't have to. And every 50 saves or something like that, it'll give a modal that says, "Hey, why don't you register?" And you can tweet it. You can treat it like you treated like WinRAR back in the day, and you can just keep on using it forever, which if you like their product, do give them some money. Sublime Text is amazing. I used Sublime Text for years, and recently I switched over to VSC because I found it slightly faster to write markup in. However, both of these are just fantastic options. They're free. Sublime Text works on Windows and OS X, last I checked, and VSC naturally, of course, runs on Windows, but also runs on OS X, and they're super fast. And these are, VSC especially, these are development level platforms. Like you can get some serious work done in VSC, and so it's definitely something to consider if you want to use a tool that's more advanced than, say, Notepad. And there are some benefits. Let me get back to, whoop, gracious. Yes, there are, of course, some benefits of using these apps, of course. If I can get this, again, the perils of live streaming. All right, don't show my image, fine. These special code editors, they're very useful, as they can, they're time savers for one thing, and they can also sometimes, depending on what plugins or packages you have installed, you can have them audit your code, and so it'll, using its own rules, it'll go through your code and say, hey, there's a problem here, you forgot an end tag here, I don't know what this means, so on and so forth. So you can do a little troubleshooting, some bug hunting in your markup, which is very useful. Which of course, Notepad and TextEdit can't do. They don't know what you're typing. They don't care. They can't help you. And I'll try to zoom in a little bit. And so this is what some markup looks like inside of VSC. And again, this is I have no expectation of you knowing what any of this means or does. However, what I intend, or the purpose of me showing you this, is to get an idea of the color coding that we have going on here. And so you'll notice certain portions have certain colors, which are, of course, there for a reason. You can change these colors. So if you know what each color means, you can look at it quickly, and you'll be able to, it makes your markup more scannable. You can read it a lot quicker, and so you can find issues faster. And of course, you'll notice here each line is numbered, and very often in browsers, if you're looking in the developer console, which is a little bit advanced for the scope of this discussion, if you're looking in the developer console, it could say like, hey, we notice an error, or there's a warning on line 23, and you can say, oh no, let me go check what that is. And if you're using Notepad, they don't, they do not supply you with line numbers. But if you said, oh, there's an issue or there's a warning on line 23, you could find 23 and say, oh, I misspelled this, quickly fix it and move on. So a lot of time-saving techniques. And you'll also notice here on the left, this is a kind of like a file explorer, and so you could access all your files very quickly. And as you can see here, we have some CS documents, we have a JSON document as well, and everything with these icons next to it, the right-facing arrow, these are directories, these are just folders, and so it makes editing, and you can have tabs open in your code editor, so it makes editing your work and switching between documents just very quick. It's all about efficiency when you're using code editors, and so that's definitely something to keep in mind. And if you take a liking to HTML and CSS, I would strongly suggest finding a code editor that works for you, reading some reviews, finding out what's most appropriate for your workflow, and getting to know them. Because especially if if you're hired for a job that might include a bit of markup, they're going to use, if in a professional environment, no one's writing HTML and CSS in notepads or any sort of plain text editor like that. And so you'll definitely want to at least be familiar with how code editors work. And they look complicated, like this only looks normal and fine to me because I've used them before, but I could understand looking at this. This is intense, but I assure you, it's not actually that intense. Once you understand why things look the way that they do, this is no more as difficult. This is no more difficult to understand what's going on than looking at Figma, which I have the panels on the right and the left. If you've never seen this. If you've never seen Figma before, and you see all this jazz on the layers panel here, and all this stuff on the design panel, it could be overwhelming. But then you spend half an hour working in Figma, and you basically understand why everything is here, and not necessarily what it does, but why it's there. And so that's the same thing with a code editor. It just, like anything else, it takes time, right? And so let us try to return to our slide deck proper. Let me see if I did this correctly. Yes, I did. All right, so sorry for the interruption there. And as alluded to earlier, HTML documents, they run in a web browser. That's sort of how they natively run. And so your operating system, either Windows or OS 10 or however you have it set up in Linux, will open .html documents in your default browser. That is to say, if you have your Windows Explorer window open, or you have your Finder window open in OS 10, and you find a .html document, and you double click it, or you press enter in Windows or Command O in OS 10, it's going to open that document in your default browser. Now, that is not to say that's going to happen 100% of the time, because of course you can tell the operating system to open certain document types in different editors. For example, if you don't want to have your HTML documents open up automatically in the default browser and instead have them open up in Notepad or text editor or VSC or Sublime Text, then you could set that in your operating system, but the default is just to have it open up in the browser. And that's the same for CSS for the most part, but CSS doesn't have content that's going to be rendered appropriately. It's just going to show the document text. It's like opening just a plain text document. There's nothing, unless you know what you're looking for, it's probably not going to tell you a whole lot. It's not going to, it's not going to look like a web page. It's just going to look like a bunch of text, as it should. And CSS is adds style. CSS adds style to content and directs the layout of the elements in the HTML document. And so CSS and HTML, they work together. And let's see here. Boop, boop. Again, I was right on the line when I ended up finishing all these slides about 2 minutes beforehand, so again, apologies. CSS adds style to content and directs the layout of the elements in the HTML document. That is to say, CSS and HTML work together. And that's not to say that they, their dependency on each other, that's an odd way of putting it. So HTML can stand on its own and can be perfectly legible, perfectly readable. It won't be the prettiest thing in the world, but you can read an HTML document that has no style whatsoever attached to it, and you could come away understanding whatever the author of the document wanted you to know, whether it was an article on, classic cars or the rainforest. You could read it. It's not going to look fun to read, but you could read it and come away with it. CSS doesn't have any real content at all. It just helps it styles the HTML. So HTML doesn't need CSS. It's nice when it has it. It doesn't need it. CSS needs HTML is kind of an abstract way of thinking about that. CSS on its own, that's not a destination for anybody. Exactly, like no one's going to, when you go to a web page, you're going to an HTML document, broadly speaking, or like a PHP document. But when you go to a web page, you're going to an HTML, and if it has CSS, fantastic. But no one's going to a website to look at your CSS unless they're like a developer. If no style is added, as I said earlier, the browser has default values for every element, and and these are agreed upon for being the most readable, user-friendly way of displaying things. And when I say user-friendly, I also mean very low-tech. And so in many browsers, and this could be different depending on your browser, and of course you can change these settings. For example, for the longest time, and probably still is the case from what I gathered throughout today's research, Times New Roman is still the default font in browsers. So if the CSS doesn't tell the HTML document, or the HTML document can't find any CSS, the browser is going to rend text as being Times New Roman. And the reason for that is first of all, that was established decades ago as just being the default because all computers have, or like almost every single computer, at least ones that are going online and not like special server cases or things of that nature, they have Times New Roman. And if they don't have Times New Roman, they have Times, and which is a slight font family variation on Times New Roman. And so it's there because it's reliable. Times New Roman is all reliable. And you'll also see a very classic link style here. And it'll have the hex value of 0000FF or something incredibly close to that. Each browser can be slightly different, of course, and your links are going to be underlined. And so this is the classic link style right here. And of course, any web page with a style, with a style sheet attached to it, with CSS attached to it, usually makes some effort to change the link style. to something else. Like for example, the underline can only appear when you do like a mouse hover, or it's focused, or something of that nature, or it might change colors when you mouse over. And so all those are examples of style, of course. And there's also a default document flow, and I'm sure that's not the exact correct wording for that, but when you start writing HTML and you have no style attached to it, your elements are going to they're just going to be line after line of they're just they're going to drop below each other. They're not going to go like side to side, and that's what CSS is for. As stated earlier in the slide deck, the CSS determines your layout to a very large extent. And so, if you want two elements like side by side, for example, like two images side by side, or not just one directly on top of each other like a column, you're going to need CSS for that. And so again, that's not that's structural in a way, but not really. That's more of the document flow, what the layout looks like, which is of course different than structure. And just I wanted to include this because I knew this question was going to come up at some point, and if it did, I didn't want to leave anyone guessing about how we access websites once the HTML and the CSS have been created. And so I added a few slides just about hosting and whatnot. And again, that's the ins and outs of hosting and how domain registration works and what is a registrar and all these sorts of things. That's again a topic for another live stream, which I would love to get into. However, I wanted to briefly touch on this, and if for no other reason than I do recall in a previous, I believe it was a previous fireside chat, maybe maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a fairly lengthy discussion about what is the best web platform to go with if you if you intend on using a template-driven website. What is the best? What's the easiest to use? What is the least expensive? What gives you the most options? And so on and so forth. And as far as that discussion is concerned, and those questions are concerned, you'll need to DYOR, that is, do your own research. However, I can give you a little bit of information overall about how each one of these, how these platforms work in a general sense. But in any event, you don't need web hosting to develop a website. You'll need hosting for others to access it, however. So what that means is, and when I say hosting is server space. And that is to say, so if you're just on your computer, you're on your laptop, you're on your desktop, and you're writing in Notepad, or you're writing in VSC or text editor, you're banging out some HTML and some CSS, and you save that document, well, it's saved in most cases, unless you have like a home server set up, in which case you probably know this stuff already. You're saving those files to your hard drive, or your solid state, or USB drive, whatever the case may be. You're saving it locally. It's local to you, and that is to say it's probably not accessible via a network. And you can open those files just fine and look at them on your computer. And indeed, that's very often people will develop their websites on their own computer, get it to where they like it, and then put it on their hosting. In any event, just for a smooth rollout. In any event, hosting is like server space. And when you sign up for a company like Squarespace, Wix, or Webflow, and I've only peripherally used these technologies because I pay for my own hosting, but they give you a certain amount of space. For example, when you sign up for, and I'm guessing here, when you sign up for Squarespace, they might say, hey, welcome to Squarespace. You can get we'll host your files for you. You can upload your files to us, and they might give you 1 or 2 gigabytes of storage, and that's where you would upload your HTML documents, your style sheet, that is, say, your CSS document. If you have any photos or any illustrations, anything that would be taken care of with the IMG or the image element, you would upload those as well. And they would give you, they would allocate you a certain amount of storage. And when you when you upload your documents to them. That is to say, when you make a copy of it and send it to them, they're going to host it, meaning it's going to live on their servers. Of course, you can change it as you want, and they will, what do servers do? They serve. And so if another user wants to access the document, the HTML document you created, they would go to your Squarespace address, your Wix address, the web page or your site you made via Webflow, and they would be able to load that document because it's being hosted by Squarespace's servers or Wix's servers, or I'm not sure how Webflow works on their back end exactly, but that will be served to the user because they're hosting it. And of course, Squarespace and to a lesser extent Wix. I think Wix is sort of not doing so hot these days. Could be wrong. I know Squarespace is killing it as far as the template-driven platforms are concerned. You can pay for web hosting, but the price is relatively inexpensive. And that is to say, from what I can tell, there might be like a free Squarespace you can use. Well, okay, I don't want to say things that aren't true, having not used their website, but a long time ago, and I'm not sure how long that is, but a while ago, WordPress was a lot more popular than it is now. And WordPress, of course, it wasn't the first, but it was certainly one of the more popular blogging platforms. And very often, if you went to someone's WordPress site, it would be, I don't know, ethangregg.wordpress.org.com. I forget what their extension is, or their domain type is, but WordPress would be the host. Your content is on their servers. Well, all content is on somebody's servers, but what you could do is, and that's how if you signed up through them, and there are probably different tiers where you could pay a certain amount per month depending on what features you wanted, but there, if I remember correctly, there was a free tier, and they'd give you a paltry amount of space, like a quarter of a gig or something like that, and this was back when hard drive space was more expensive per gigabyte. It's pennies, if not less than that, per gigabyte these days. I mean, it's not unheard of at all to have multiple terabyte, especially in servers. You can buy a laptop with a terabyte of space these days, and people don't blink. That's just normal. However, if you didn't want to pay, you would sign up for WordPress, and and if someone wanted to access that, they would go to your WordPress name .wordpress.com. Another option WordPress has, I'm sure they still have it, is you can download all the WordPress files, the source file, the installer, and you can go to your own host, the one you're paying money for, and you can run the installer and have it set up. So, for example, if you had, if you owned the domain and you paid for hosting for, again, ethangregg.com, you can install WordPress there, and it would run, and it would look basically exactly the same as having, yourname.wordpress.com as opposed to yourname.com having installed WordPress there. It would look exactly the same. And so there are options, of course, depending on how much you want to pay, how complicated you want to make things. Not to say the HTML and CSS is complicated, but compared to dragging and dropping elements, images and text and whatnot, it's a lot less complicated, if you want to think of it that way. And so there are drawbacks to both sides. If you want your own domain, if you want I have several domains that I've purchased over the years, and I keep up with the payments. Recently, I think I just registered a new domain for and hosting for my portfolio site, which is coming soon. I'll discuss that in a future stream. And it's a two-step process. Purchase is the wrong word. You can't really own, I'm not sure legally speaking, but you don't really own your domain. Like if you wanted myname.design or myname.com, basically you're kind of renting that. It's not something you buy once. You buy it for a number of years at a time, and you sort of rent it from an institution called ICANN, or ICANN, I forget exactly, but you just rent it. Now, as far as the law is concerned, you might own it, but I'm not equipped to speak on that. I am not an attorney. And so you can own a domain name, but then you will also need hosting. So you can own a domain name, you can own yourname.com, but then that's different from hosting. You'll need someone to host your files for you. And very often you'll find a company that'll just do both at the same time. And a good example of that is, let me jump over to my browser here, is domain.com. Now, of course, I'm not sponsored by them. I'm not sponsored by anybody, but I've done business with domain.com for about 15 years now. And they're good. They've certainly gotten better over the years. And I use them because their control panel, I'm used to it. They've got good tools. I like their security, and they have really good prices. And I promise I won't spend too much on this, but if you want your own .com or .org or .design, .tech, whatever the case may be, and there are so many different versions there are a lot of different things you can get these days. .coms, they offer those from $99 or $9.99. .nets from $12.99. .orgs from $8.99. Of course, each one of these has their own use case. .org is .organization. .com is .commercial, or is for commercial entities, orgs, and net. That .com's only being for commercial entities. That doesn't really mean much anymore. That's sort of an old school way of thinking about it, but that's the original intent. And .orgs are pretty much for organizations, typically like nonprofits and things like that will have .orgs, and so if you're making a UX UI portfolio, you probably don't want a .org. That would be like if someone sees .org on your business card or on your resume, that would be an odd thing. But you could do your cool name, and you do a search on domain.com, and it would look all across the internet. It would look all across the available domains, and it would say in each type of website like this type of like domain.com or GoDaddy or HostGator, I think it would also work. You can do a search for the domain that you want, like for example yourcoolname.com. It says that domain is available. No one currently has that website, and they would also offer you options in case that didn't exist. They might say like, oh, how about one of these other domains? So you can get yourcoolname.org, .net, .tech, .online, .store, .site, .space. And as you can see, it goes on for quite a while, and indeed, it just loaded another page of results here. And there are many domain types available these days, and some are more expensive than others. IOs can sometimes be more expensive as opposed to .me's, which are less expensive, at least with this domain name. The shorter the name, the more expensive it's going to be. I can assure you of that. And as we can see here, so just the domain purchase by itself, 2 years is the default, $20.98. So essentially you're paying what, $10.50 a year to have access and be the quote-unquote owner of an example website. That's my earlier example. It would be about $10.50 per year to own quote-unquote yourcoolname.com. And Domain will also sell you hosting, and they have a great price there as well. I think I'm getting several, maybe a terabyte of space, which I'm going to use maybe 500 megabytes, so way more than I ever need. I guess it would be like 1/20th of what I would actually need, but they give you a very great, they give you a gratuitous amount of server space, and for a very small amount of money. I couldn't find the receipt in my email in a timely fashion, but I think when I set up my my new website, I went through Domain. As I said, I've been doing business with them for years, and I was able to get hosting for 2 years, and with the .design, and I got some hosting, and there was like a one-time upfront fee of $40, and then a fee that comes around every year. So I think on day one when I got everything set up, I may have spent like between $40 and $60, and then every 365 days are going to ask for like $20 to $40, depending on what hosting I'm paying for, which I think is that works for me in my financial situation. And your situation, of course, could be different. It likely is different. Everyone, of course, has different situations. And so there are definitely times when it is more appropriate to use Squarespace or Wix or Webflow or any number of free hosting options. Of course, as I say here, they do have drawbacks, such as, and one of the biggest drawbacks is They might not be the fastest websites to load in the world. They might be a little slow, again, depending on what sort of content you're delivering. If it's mostly text, that's going to be fine. And text is very, takes up very little space as far as file size is concerned. And if you find that you're going with the free option and it's loading slow, and you have like images and video, you might throttle the video, you might exclude the video, make a link to a YouTube page instead. And if you have access to Photoshop, but I'm sure there's websites available these days that you could reduce the file size. It would also reduce the quality, but you could reduce the file size of images as well to really get that file size that the browser has to, that the user has to download to display the website properly. You can get that down pretty low if you need to. And of course, one of the biggest drawbacks is you might have to deal with ads. And that was certainly the case a while ago, where if you wanted free hosting, the deal was they're going to put ads on your site. And how ads are delivered these days has changed significantly thanks to Google AdSense sort of changed the game about how advertising works. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to force ads on you if you choose to go with a free option. Again, that might not matter to you at all, and so you'll need to consider each one of these things. Do your own research, DYOR, on these sorts of companies and platforms to see what works best for you. And of course, it's in reference to each one of these specifically, I can't comment on which one is best. Again, they're best for different people at different times and different situations. I have heard that Squarespace is fairly easy to get started on. Webflow is a bit more advanced. I use Webflow briefly. I kept hearing about it. I wanted to know exactly what it was, and it reminded me a bit of Dreamweaver back when that was a thing. It might still be a thing. I have no idea, but I'm not sure who would use that these days. In any event, these are all sort of your drag and drop, plug and play content. You plug your content into certain areas, and it's going to display. It's going to look good. They have professional developers creating these templates, and they know what they are doing, and they're mobile ready, and so you're going to get a fairly good product when you use these. However, again, a big opinion warning: the medium is the message when it comes to being a designer and having a portfolio using one of these. But again, that's on you to look up exactly what I'm alluding to. Back to HTML. Sorry for that lengthy side tangent there on hosting, but I just wanted to give a bit of information about that. And of course, if there's any questions about hosting, domain registration, how the web works, I'm on Slack, of course. I'm on LinkedIn. You can send me a message there, and I would love to talk about this. I love talking about this stuff. And so, back to HTML. HTML tags, they indicate the kind of content they contain, and that may be self-evident, but I did want to point that out. And so, for example, these are our old friends, the headline elements. And so we have H1, which is a huge headline. Headlines don't get, among headlines, H1 is the largest, H2 is a bit smaller, and H3 is even smaller. And so just by looking at the element, by looking at the tag, you can determine what type of, not what type of content, but you can get an idea of how it's going to look on the web page. And that is to say, sort of what you see is what you get. It's kind of WYSIWYG in this way, and so it's very scannable. It's very readable by humans, as opposed to some languages aren't that readable, aren't that scannable unless you really know the code that well. Like you could have just like pages and pages and pages and all sorts of blocks of C++, and if you just took a look at it in the middle, a middle block of code, you might not know what you're looking at or what this is supposed to do. Is this an application that helps medical devices read glucose, or is this part of a game? It might not be clear to you at all, unless you are either the author or you're very deep into the code and you can know exactly what it is just by looking at it. HTML, on the other hand, you can pretty much just look at any point of any HTML document and say, yeah, I know what that does right there, just because the tags are pretty, again, once you know what they're for, it's self-evident. And also the content inside is going to give a big indication as to what the tag is going to do. And so let's see here. Tags, and this is where we're getting into a little bit of CSS here. This is where the introduction to CSS is coming in very slowly. So, tags can contain attributes. They don't have to, but they can. Which style the content. And attributes have properties. Attributes on their own, there might be a few attributes that can exist by themselves, but none that I can think of just off the top of my head. Attributes have properties. And so let us examine this line of markup right quick. And so we have the starting H1 tag. But instead of the greater than glyph right here, the greater than symbol right here, there's a space. And then we see style equals open quotation mark, color, colon, blue, in quotation mark, greater than sign. And so, and then we have the actual text that is the headline, and then of course we have the ending H1 tag. And so, as opposed to this tag right here, which is just the H1 element, this has a style attached to it, and it actually says style here, so it's pretty easy to determine what's going on. And the style has attributes and properties. The attribute is that's exactly what it says on the tin. It is the attribute. And so attributes are things like colors, font size, box shadow, the radius on a corner. It's not called corner radius, that's Figma. But anything that can be changed visually is going to be your attribute. And then your property is going to be how is it changed. And so the attribute in this example is color. So we're considering color. We're going to change the color. And the property is blue. And that is the only thing that changes in this H1, in this headline. And so big headline would be rendered thusly, and it's exactly the same as it would be without the style color blue, except it would be just jet black. It would be 000000. But because we said blue, it has a blue color, which I didn't look the hex up exactly, but I'm sure it's 0000FF. And so this is what it's going to look like. And you can use, sometimes there are, for some attributes, there are many different ways of giving a property. And so, for example, I should have created a slide on this, but I didn't want to get too in the weeds. The property here, it just says blue. Now, there are many, as far as colors are concerned, it's actually surprising the amount of colors that you can list just by name. There's like Alice Blue, maybe there's like a Kelly or Hunter Green, Topaz, all these fun color names, and there's maybe several hundred of them. I don't know how many there are because I hardly ever use property names like this. What's very common, because blue can mean different things to different browsers. The browser default might be off a few hex values from 0000FF, and so it's sort of a very loose way of defining your property. And so a better way would be, for example, typing in a hex value right here, which would begin with the pound sign or the hashtag for you kids. So it would be pound sign 0000FF, and that would be your property, and that would work just fine. You would get the exact same thing. Or you could apply like a RGB value, or RGBA, A being the alpha channel, which is all about transparency, and that's a value between 0 and 1, which usually a decimal, like 50% would be 0.5 or 0.5. And even in there, even in like RGB, RGBA, there's multiple ways of giving the same color value. The cool thing about HTML, and specifically right here, CSS, is it gives you so much control, especially with, attributes like color. There are so many ways of determining exactly what color you want the user to see, and so it gives you a lot of freedom if you have a specific way of doing things, and it's compliant with CSS. You can probably use it. The most important thing, of course, is being consistent. You would want to avoid having a CSS document that uses hex values, RGB, RGBA, HSV. You'd want to probably just choose one. I could understand in some situations where you would have more than one, but generally speaking, just choose one and go with it, because it makes it easier for everybody. It makes development a lot easier. And you should also maybe use variables, but again, that's a different conversation altogether. And so, broadly speaking, CSS is attributes and their properties. That's what makes up CSS. as we can see here, attribute and property. Attribute being what's changed, what is going to be changed, what's being considered, and the property is what it's changing to, or how it's being altered in some form or fashion. Now there are three main ways of writing CSS. There is inline, internal, and external. And so in this example right here, we have the sorry, I forgot my words there. We have the attribute and we have the property. And so this, the red underline right here, beginning with the S in style and going all the way to the closing quotation mark, this is called inline CSS. And inline is written inside the tag inline, that is to say, with the opening tag, never the closing tag, or never the ending tag. Like you wouldn't put this CSS here in the ending tag. That wouldn't render properly, I don't believe. I've never tried it. It seems like a while. I don't know why anyone would do that. But the point is, it goes in the starting H1, or it goes in the starting tag. This is called inline CSS, and this is a way to style sort of line by line or element by element, and it's a not great way of doing things. And it certainly has its uses if you want to test something out very quickly just to see how it works, and you don't want to edit for whatever reason. You didn't want to open your CSS document and edit it there, or if you didn't want to scroll up for a minute and change it in your internal CSS, you could just write it inline, but it's frowned upon. It doesn't make for a very clean document, and it's generally accepted to be a bad practice. And so by the time you're finished with your document and you want to put it on hosting and you're ready for the world to see it, you should absolutely avoid inline CSS where at all possible. And again, there are some edge cases where it's appropriate, but let's not use inline CSS where we can avoid it. And of course, I'll toward the end, when I'm doing sort of a markup example, I will use inline CSS to show you how it works, but then I'll also show you better ways of doing it. And so again, we have inline, internal, and external, different ways of writing CSS. You get the same effect, or the outcome is always the same. It's just three different ways of doing it. And this is, again, inline CSS. And internal, which is the second way of writing CSS, is useful when you want to sequester, or you separate your CSS from your HTML. And so as we can see here, we have the head element. And we know from the previous slides that so right above this tag, right above the starting head tag, what would we see? Well, we'd see the start HTML, because as we remember, HTML element has two children, and that is the head element and the body element. And so this would be at the very top. This would be very close to the top of the HTML document, if not the second line, maybe the third. And so what else do we know about the head element? Well, what goes inside the head element? It's not content, because that goes inside body. The head element is for metadata. That's where data about the HTML document lives. And so when if I copy and pasted this into an HTML document, this text exactly is not going to be displayed on the page, because it's in the head, and content in the head element is not displayed on the page. And for what it's worth, this is called a selector. But this is another way of doing exactly the same thing here. This would have the same effect here. The only difference is, because this is inline, having this style right here only affects this one H1, this one heading. If you were to have, and again, this is a bad idea, but if you were to have multiple H1s in your HTML document, if they were only like this and didn't have any attributes or properties, they're just going to render as black, or whatever the default text color, the default color you have set up in your browser, or if you didn't change it, just whatever the default of the browser is, it's just going to come out black. In this instance, this headline is going to come out blue, but if you had another H1 element below it, it's going to be black. And if you didn't give it a style, if you just had H1, big headline, end H1 tag, it's just going to be black, because this inline is only for that one specific tag. It doesn't affect all tags. And so this right here, the way this is read is, so we have the style, we have the head element, and inside of the head element we have a child element, and that is the style element. And of course, style is not a void element, so we have a start style tag and we have an end style tag. And inside the style tag is, well, you guessed it, that's where our styles go. This is where our CSS lives, or it's one of the three places our CSS lives, I should say. And so what this does is every single H1, that is to say every H1 tag, every H1 element is going to have the color of blue. And so every single, again, don't do this, just have one H1 per page, please. It goofs up the HTML outline for screen readers. Every H1 you place, they're all going to be blue. And there are some different selectors that some different types of selectors where you can choose like every third H1, or the second from the last H1, or you can be very specific with which one you're targeting. However, just to don't want to get too into that right now. This selects every single H1, and you can see that it's wrapped with curly braces, and that's how styles are written. I don't have an explanation for that. That's just how it is. And when you're dealing with code, when you're dealing with markup, you see curly braces just all over the place. And so the way this would be, again, the way you would understand this is every single H1 is going to have this attribute and this property, because it's inside of these curly braces. Every single H1 is going to have the color blue. And so you can get you can have multiple lines here. You can have H1 color blue, and then you would want to put a semicolon at the end, which would tell the browser, like, okay, I'm ready for another one. Now, give me another attribute and a property. I believe that the best way to do it is when you only have one attribute, you don't need to put a semicolon at the end, it's unnecessary. But if you were to have multiple, like font weight 600, and you were just having multiple styles for the H1, or you want to make it italicized, or maybe strike through, or you wanted to maybe adjust the margin above or the margin below, each one of those lines would be separated by a semicolon. And so you can add many styles at once to each selector this way, which is why it's a lot easier to edit a lot of things in mass. If you wanted to select, that's what that's why this is a selector. It selects all the different elements, and of course you can again, you can determine which ones exactly you want to select. But broadly speaking, this is a much better way of writing your CSS compared to inline style. And this is called internal because it's still internal. Like, this lives in the HTML document. However, it is in its own little section living in the head element. And so all your CSS is located there, and hopefully you wouldn't have any CSS in the body element of your HTML document. And I couldn't make this small enough to where it would appear in its normal little box, so I apologize for that. And external CSS is the most widely used method, and I say that with an asterisk. Every time I go to, if someone posts a link to their portfolio, when I go there, before the page even loads, the first thing I do is I right-click and I go to the menu pops up, and usually I think second from the bottom is an option to view page source, and that's the first thing I do. And I noticed very often, and this is probably just an artifact of having a very complex platform, your Squarespaces, your Wixes, your Webflows, they have CSS just like all over the place. CSS here, inline CSS, internal and external CSS, sometimes all three all together. And so it's very messy code, and that's one of the reasons I don't care for those platforms, is their code is messy. It renders fine, but I don't know. It's like having it's like makeup on a pig is a very rude thing to say, but that's the first thing I do because I want to see when someone's made it themselves, so I can think it will when I see HTML that's written by a person rather than a machine or by a template, you can tell pretty quickly when that's the case. And also You can determine the style the person writes in, or like how they're approaching HTML and CSS, and you can get a lot of information by reading their HTML and CSS, and you can understand their thought process sometimes, and so it's interesting, and it can open up some communication. If you know someone wrote their own HTML and CSS, you can say, hey, I noticed you used you used a flex box instead of a grid, or I would have used a grid instead of a flex box. Why? Let's talk about that. Why'd you do that? And not that you need to know what that means, but it's fun to talk about these things. Anyway, the third way, the external way of bringing in style is here's our head elements, and so this right here, this is metadata, and so this text will not display in the viewport when you load the HTML document. We and I'll explain. I'll try my best to explain this the best I can. And so we have a link that the browser understands. Oh, okay, it's a style sheet, and the type of data that it's going to see, or the type of information, is going to be text, and it's going to be of type CSS. And href is the hyperlink referral or reference. I forget which one it is, but this tells this specific part right here, href equals, and then in quotes, file name.css, and it's usually like style.css or styles.css. This tells the document where it's located, so it's going to, when the browser is reading the HTML and it gets to this point, it says, oh, okay, I need to load this document and add this style to the HTML. So it's going to go on the server, it's going to find the style.css document, it's going to see that, assuming it's written properly, it's going to take this style and it's going to apply it to the HTML that it's currently loading. And that way you can keep all of your CSS, this is the point of doing it this way, is you keep all your CSS, all your styles in a separate document. You keep it away from your HTML. Not that they don't play well together, they get along famously. However, it's a way to modularize the language that you're writing in, modularize your content, and it makes editing one or the other a lot easier, and it makes for, you're going to have two different files, sure, but they're going to be, if you just crammed everything into one file, your file size is going to be a little bit smaller. When you're dealing with two, they might add up to the same file size. And yeah, file size really isn't that big of a deal these days with people's super fast internet and whatnot, but that's an accessibility issue, and you can't rely on everyone to have Google Fiber, and so it's just something to keep in mind. But that's beside the point. That's not the big deal. The big deal is you keep your documents separate. You have your HTML on the HTML side, and you have your CSS on the CSS side. Your style sheet, your styles stay away from your HTML, and it's brought in when the HTML document loads. It's brought in and the styles are applied. However, it keeps them separate, and so you can edit one at a time. You can edit your HTML, not have to worry about your CSS, and vice versa. And so this is another way of doing it. And of course, this is metadata, so it lives in the head element, and this is how it's done usually. And it makes for much, again, as it says here, it makes for modular design and a very clean looking document, assuming you're writing your HTML clean to begin with. And so, typically, one would write their HTML prior to writing the CSS. Now you can do both at the same time. I vacillate between what I do and what I do not do, depending on if I have a style that I want to bang out the CSS for really quick. I'll probably write the CSS first, just so I don't forget it. But overall, you will want to write your HTML first, because you're going to need something to style. You need content to apply CSS to, right? And so ideally, you would have all your content ready to go. Like, let's say that you wanted to make a web page for your case study. Well, the first thing you need to do is write your case study, and you'd have your headlines, your subheads, your breadcrumbs if you're using them, all of your illustrations, your images. You would have a link to your prototype, and so you would have this stuff ready to go, and you know how you want it to be, how you want it to look, because you've in your text editor, Google Documents for example, you've kind of given it a style already, more than likely. Your headline would be red routes, and then you might have a subheading that explains a few characters, maybe 180 characters, Twitter style, to explain the highlight of your grid routes, or the most important part of your grid routes, and then you might have a paragraph or two and then an image. And so you already have kind of a format of how you want everything to look. And so once you have the format, you can quickly bring that in. You can apply HTML to that. Otherwise, what are you writing your HTML for? What are you building a structure for? What is the skeleton? And so you want content before you start making anything. And of course, that is to say, if you want to just start practicing and you don't have any content exactly, and you don't want to, let's say you just want to practice CSS, but you don't want to, or HTML and CSS, but you don't have any content in mind, like you have a case study, for example, but you don't want to make a web page for your case study, then you could just type lorem ipsum, or you could just make a web page about your favorite things, or whatever the case may be, and you could just make that up as you go along. That's completely fine. But generally speaking, for production, you have copy ready, and you're doing this with a point. And that is to say, HTML comes before CSS, structure comes before style. And this is an example. This is a photo I found earlier on Google image search of what an HTML document would look like if it had no style attached to it. If CSS failed to load, or there was no CSS, no style written for it, this is what it would look like. And as I brought up earlier, this is perfectly readable. You can get all the information you need by reading this. And World Wide Web, this headline right here, this is, I need to see the markup, but this is more than likely has a starting H1 tag, and then inside the tag, inside the element, it has World Wide Web, and then it has an ending H1 tag right here. These paragraphs have the P element, P is for paragraph, and I'll get to that in a little bit here. And then we have some links and whatnot. And so this would look a lot different if there were style attached to it, but it's readable. You can see what's going on here. And so this is the browser using its default attributes and properties to style this in a way that's, again, at least scannable and usable by humans. And so structure is given to copy and other elements, images, so on and so forth, with tags, as we discussed very early on in this incredibly long, I apologize, stream. And common tags include H1, which is the heading tag that we've discussed ad nauseum at this point, P, which I just mentioned, and P is paragraph, IMG, which is image, and if you recall, IMG is a void element. There is no ending tag for image. And then we have A, which is, A is short for anchor, and it is how you give a link to another web page, to another resource, I should say. It doesn't have to be a web page. You could link to a PDF, and if a user clicked on that link, it would either take them to the .pdf, which many browsers do these days. They can render PDFs just fine, or it may ask the user to download the PDF. And so there's many things you can do with links. And but before anyone calls me out on this, and I did this on several screens in this slide deck here, I am aware, and I did this on purpose, that I put a space here and here at the very at the beginning and the end of the content, before, after the start tag and before the end tag. I did that on purpose just to make it a bit clearer to read. I understand that you would not write markup this way. I did that for for usability, and this markup is fine. It would look fine, but that's just so it's easy to read. And so what we have so far, and again, I know I'm going over things over and over again, and there is a reason. I did do some editing, and I assure you this is on purpose. And so H1, all this text in here, all this copy, is going to be, as I put, big old headline. This is going to be a huge headline on your page. And of course, you can change the font size and the color as you see fit. But just leaving it like this, it's going to be a headline. Anything inside the P element, or any content that's inside the starting P tag and ending P tag, is going to be a paragraph of copy. And paragraphs, they render in a specific way, and you'll want to use. So you can, how do I say this? You could use different tags for whatever you wanted to, and you could put different content types however you wanted to. You could put a single word inside of a paragraph tag if you wanted to. That's not, and it would probably look fine depending on what you were going for with your design. A very large piece of advice is a lot of these tags, a lot of these elements are semantic for a reason. They are called what they're called because they have a very specific purpose. And specifically, very much when you're dealing with screen readers, when screen readers see H1, when the software sees an H1, it understands, like it's building a hierarchy in its software. It understands H1 as a headline, which if you're using a screen reader, these are ways of navigating the web page. And so you wouldn't, a good piece of, that is to say, a good piece of advice, for example, is if you're, H1 is for the biggest headline of the page, don't use it for anything other than that, because it's going to screw up screen readers, and those users who use screen readers are going to wonder why you put not headline worthy information in your headline, or why a paragraph has like 2 words in it. It's going to be odd and mysterious. Like these things are, they're named the way they're named for a reason. And if you don't have a paragraph of text that you want to display, if you have fewer words than necessary that would constitute a paragraph, there are specific tags for just a line of text, like a span, for example. Again, we'll get to that at some point. And so you use the tags as they are intended. You can certainly not, and it'll probably render fine, but this stuff was not on, these tags and their purpose was not an accident. It was not chosen at random. And so try to be consistent and play by the rules, so to speak. Know when to break them, but you need to know the rules first, of course. And let's see here. Another common tag that you see all the time is the image tag, or this is the image, an image element. And so instead of image, it's just img. And the src, the way this is written is image source is dog.jpg. And this tells the browser, okay, we have an image element coming up here, and the source is, here's where to find it. And you could have a very complex file path right here, like directory/directory/images/dog.jpg, or if it were on the, I won't get into directory structure of how this all works right now, but it says, okay, and then this is the file. We're looking for an image. This is the image file, dog.jpg, and it'll put the image of the dog, the JPEG, on the screen at whatever the default width by height is of the image. And of course you can change how large things are using HTML and CSS and so on and so forth. But and then lastly right here is the A tag, the link element. And as I said earlier, A is short for anchor, and you may wonder why didn't they just say link instead? Well, link is its own tag and does something similar but different. But so A is just this is how you make a link. This is, if you had no style, this would just be the blue underlined link that you could click on. If you clicked on this link, it would take you to Google. And as you can see here, unlike, one of these things is not like the other, and it's, again, img because it's a void element. There is no ending tag to it. And so your link or your anchor tag here has a starting tag, which is your A, and then your /A is your end tag here. And again, all end tags are / the name of the tag, which in this case is A. So, and then href points, it gives the URL, or it gives, that's about it, it's not the URL, it gives the location. It tells the browser the location of what you're linking to. And this could be a file on your own server. It could be a different point on your web page. You could click a link and have it snap to or gently scroll to a different part of your web page if you had a very long web page with a lot of information. Or you could link to an external resource, such as, for example, google.com. And so the text that's here, this content right here, this is what's going to, and I'll give an example, you'll see the example of this in the markup that I write, but this is what's going to be visible as being clickable. The browser doesn't know to display like the title of the web page, or it doesn't know what the web page is called, and so you need to give a link. You need to write the content for what the link looks like. And so this right here, Google, is what's going to be underlined and in blue. Or even though it says Google here, you could write in Google, a search engine, and then that's how it's going to appear. That'll be more apparent in a little bit here. And so, actually, sooner rather than later. Another option, which I didn't discuss earlier, and that's sort of on purpose for the way I'm going to segue this, is multiple ways of writing CSS and HTML. So again, OS 10, we have text edit. On Windows, we could use something like Notepad, plain text editors. We can also download your code editors such as Sublime Text or VSC. And there's a third option. Very cool. There are certain websites like codepen.io, which you may be familiar with. You might have seen links to CodePen that they're sort of online editors. You can write HTML and you can write CSS at their website, and you can see what it looks like in close to real time, and it's very cool. And I find CodePen and, pardon me one second, I find CodePen and its equivalents, such as, there's JS Fiddle, and actually those are the only two I can think of right now, but if you do a Google search or whatever your favorite search engine is, if you do a search for live HTML editor or live CSS HTML editor, you can find a site where you can type code in, or you can type markup in, and it'll show you what it's going to look like. And it's a very quick way to develop pages. And I've, in the past, for whatever reason, I've done a lot of goofy things. I've written entire web pages on codepen.io. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to share it to another team member really quickly. There's a variety of reasons why that's. You could do that. You might not want to do that, but I've developed whole pages on codepen.io, and it's quick because it takes a lot of the effort away from the user, which is a good thing. It allows you sort of quick results to see if what you're doing is correct. And so I believe, yes, that is the end of the slide deck. So I appreciate you sticking with me. I know that took a long time, and I went over things over and over again, but again, that was on purpose. And so, and again, I could talk about this for hours, and I did not mean to alt-tab to this, but this is something I'm working on, and I'm using, it's just called, it calls itself Code in OS 10, but I'm using, this is VSC, Visual Studio Code, and again, this may look sort of overwhelming, but again, once you get used to things, once you get used to things, you're used to them. And as you can see right here, I would zoom in, but I'm not sure I can. Whoop. There we go. And so we see, just as a quick example, we see the title right here, Bill Ricks, UX Designer. And so this is going to show up in the tab. And because this is in the head, we know it's in the head because this is metadata, and indeed we have some metadata right here. Style, which is the style element, again, metadata. This is very similar to what we saw earlier in the slide deck. This is a selector. It's selecting every single H1 element. And the attribute, get out of the way there. The attribute is the font size, and the property is 3EM, which is a multiplier of the base font size, which is usually 16 pixels. Anyway, that's again a discussion for another day. But so if this were a classroom, I would ask, and so what type of CSS is this? And so this would be what I'm writing right here, because it's inside of the head element. Well, it's not external because I'm not linking to a CSS document elsewhere on the server or on my computer, and it's not inline because I don't. It's not applying an attribute and a property to a specific HTML tag. So this would be internal. This is internal CSS that I'm writing, and what I do is and you can see I do actually have a separate .css document over here, but I'm trying some different styles out, some alternatives. I'm doing some A/B testing, so to speak, on an HTML document. What I do is very often I'll write internal CSS, and then once I'm satisfied with the way it looks, I'll copy the entirety of the internal CSS to a separate file, like style.css, for example, and then I'll just delete this entire portion from open style tag to end style tag out of the HTML document, and then just link to it. That's my style, and it works for me, and you should do what works for you. But in any event, let's go here. We don't need domain anymore, and so let's go to code. Yes, I do want to leave. Let's go to codepen.io. If you go to CodePen, this is what their page looks like, and of course it's a bit different on mobile, but this is what CodePen looks like. And so, and these are the code people write, the markup people write, are called pins, and this is what some users have come up with lately, and they can show you some like really cool stuff that they've done. Like this here's interactive Super Mario. This written in, you know, that could be HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and so people can do some amazing, very powerful stuff. CSS and HTML and JavaScript are super powerful when you know how to use them. And so just people are doing amazing things. There's an animated tab bar. And so just they're creating it inside using this website. But anyway, it'll automatically take you to the trending portion. And so if we go to just codepin.io, takes you to trending. What you want to do is navigate to your left-hand panel here. And one of the first options under the create area here is pin. And when you click pin, it takes you to this screen right here. And we see four main elements going on here, aside from this header up here, which has the name of the document that you're working on, which you don't have to save it if you don't want to. They'll store it on their server for you. They're not a host, so you cannot use CodePen as a host. However, you can store some text to them to share to others to show what you've been working on, which is indicated by this save icon with the cloud there. So saving on servers, certain settings, the layout, and you can pin it. And of course, I am logged in, so this is my icon, which I have no idea why it looks like that. But what we're really looking at here is this square right here, which is HTML, and this is where you would write your HTML, CSS. Exactly what you think it does. You would write your CSS here, and writing CSS here is the same thing as writing external CSS, except you don't have to declare where the link is. You don't need to link to this over here. It automatically does it for you, so it's very cool. And then here is where you would write JavaScript. So codepin.io is like the full stack front end sort of playground, so to speak. Not to diminish it in any way, but this is where you do like a quick or cool project you want to show somebody else. And so JavaScript is part of the front end stack. And so we're not doing any JavaScript. We're not doing any JS. And so if you click this downward arrow right here, we have a couple of options. And what we're going to do is we're going to click Minimize JavaScript Editor. And so it doesn't get rid of it, it just sort of hides it over here. And so we could bring it back if we want to, but I do not want to do that. And so I'm going to keep it mostly hidden over there. And so that also maximizes the space we have, or maximize the width of the HTML. So we have roughly 50% to work with over here, and the other 50% is our CSS. And then this big white space down here. And this is just super cool. I know this is old tech at this point, but I love that this works, and I think it's great for just doing practice and not having to worry about using a code editor or saving your files locally and monkeying around with stuff like that. This is easy if you want to do some practice, and we're going to do just a tiny bit of that. I'm not going to take too much of your time doing the practice here, but I did want to show you how CodePen works, just so you get an idea. And they all kind of, CodePen, JS Fiddle, any live HTML editor kind of works in the same way. So if you've used one, not that you used them all, because each one of them has different features, but you'll get an idea of how they work. And so we can start by we're going to write some HTML right quick. Just a little quick example. And so if we think back to the slide deck, what does the foundation of HTML look like? Okay, well, what are the three main components of HTML? Well, the first one could be a bit obvious. It's the start HTML tag, and we know that's not a void element, so start HTML tag, because there's a starting tag, there has to be an ending tag, and we know ending tags begin with the /, and so we can go ahead and start with that. And so it color codes for you, which is just awesome. And so I have my HTML start tag here. I'll press enter, and you'll notice that it automatically added an indent. It handles spacing for you, which is, you might not like the way it does it, but it handles spacing for you, which is very handy. And so I want to continue with that thought. And so again, not a void element, so I need to have an ending HTML tag. So I'll do /HTML. And when I completed that tag, you notice when I added that greater than symbol, it got rid of the padding, because it knows, and I know these are unsaved changes. It'll also nag you about unsaved changes, but you can not pay attention to that unless you want to save. And so that's why I'm going to be closing those throughout this example. And so, okay, we're moving in the right direction. This is looking good so far. And Okay, what are the, we know there's three components, HTML. There's three things we're working with. So we have HTML, and HTML, if it's the parent, it has two children, and the children are siblings, hierarchically speaking. And so, and we also recall that HTML is kind of like a body, like a human body, or like I guess a mammalian body in general. And okay, well, mammalian body has a head and a body, and so we can add these, no problem. And so I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on OS or on a MacBook to add a space there, and I'll go ahead and type in not body, head, because the head is above the body, and that is the order you go in. And again, not a void element, and so, and I'll put some extra space here to make it a lot more noticeable what we're doing. And so we can also do our not voidy body and body. Okay, and it's taking care of the indentation for me, and the indentation is important in HTML and a lot of markup and code actually, because it sort of it gives a visual representation of hierarchy and children and parents and all that good stuff. And so we can also see that because of this indentation, it's a visual identifier, as I said, that both head and body, I guess they are children of the HTML element because they're indented. And so what goes inside head? Well, that's the metadata. And metadata, of course, is not displayed in the viewport. It's just information for the browser to use. And so what could we put, what are the sort of tags? What elements could we put in the head element there? Okay, well, we know that we can put title, which, again, not a void element, so we're going to need a start title tag and an end title tag. And again, just we'll ignore this, ignore that text right there for a little bit. And inside the title, we would say, like, I don't know, my cool website. Or we're doing this for sake of completion. The title here is not going to change the title here. It would under other circumstances, but CodePen is going to overwrite your title with their title, which is a pen by Bill, which is me, and I'm writing a pen. And so, but normally, whatever you write here that's inside of the title tag, that's what's going to appear up here. Like, the title on this page is domain search, for example. But in any event, you always want a title just in case. And so, okay, what else? Well, we can write some style here, and we would because style's a metadata, and so what we would do is we would do that, and then inside, after the start style tag, but before the install tag, this is where we would write our style. I don't want to do that quite yet. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of inline style to show you, again, not a great thing to do, but I want to give an explanation of how it works, and we can sort of see it working in real time. And so we have the body element here, and this is where our content goes that we want to display on the viewport. In this scenario, the viewport is going to be just this white strip that we can see here. Under normal circumstances, it would be the entirety of the web page, but we're using some special tech here, let's say. And so in my body, let's say I want to make, I want to start with a headline. What would my headline be? It would be, let's say something like, "Hey there, Twitch." And as you can notice, it takes a couple of seconds, of course, but it shows up here. Now, that's interesting. Okay. And so you'll notice what I typed up here didn't show up down here. Well, that reinforces the idea that this is metadata, and this is not rendered to the viewport. This is only for the browser's information. However, body, that's content that gets rendered to the viewport, and so that in this element. And so this is meant to simulate what the web page is going to look like. And so I have a little bit of text here, and you've noticed that I didn't. The only thing that's really wrapping the text, the only tag that's applied to the text is body, and it's just going to render it as like 16 point. It's going to render whatever text you have that's not inside of a tag, whatever copy you have that's not living inside of it or isn't wrapped in a tag. Is going to deliver it just as like whatever the default font size is at Times New Roman, probably, unless you've styled it otherwise. And so as we can see here, old classic Times New Roman, size 16, because I haven't changed any of the defaults in my browser. And okay, well, that's cool, but I want to make that a headline. So Well, if you remember our headlines, that is, what tag is the headline? It's H1, H1 for the most prominent, the largest headline. And again, it's not a void element, and so we'll need a starting H1 tag and an ending H1 tag. And so what would that look like? Well, we could do, we have a starting H1 tag, and okay, that's interesting. So you'll notice that I didn't put an end H1 tag. Okay, but it's still is rendering this as the H1. Okay, well that's interesting. And so we know that it works without the end tag. So what's doesn't that contradict what I said earlier? That all start, if there's a start tag and needs an end tag. Well, no, it doesn't, because let's say you go on to the next line and you want to start writing your you have a paragraph, you have something that you want to paste, maybe from a study or research you've done, or you just want to do a bio about yourself, a little about section. If you start to type, the text is it's still going to be large, as you can see here. And that's because even though you, unlike in a word processor, which is WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. Even though I did a line break here and it carries on, H1 is still active. The browser still sees H1 as having all this text in it. However, if we put the ending H1 tag here, we should get, yeah, there we go. Okay, so the heading started and the heading ended. And there's content inside there, but anything outside of it is unaffected by it. And you'll notice there's some white space here. The browser default accounts for several things. Again, padding, line space, margin, color, font weight, so on and so forth. And H1, even though it has no style, has defaults in the browser. And this is what the default looks like in Brave, which is not a fork, but it's a version of Chrome. And so this is what it looks like in Chrome. And this is what this is what just text outside of a tag looks like. And so that's interesting. And I want to give you an example right quick of what all the different headlines look like. So I'm going to do this. Whoop. I'll do, and it did it for me automatically. Thank you, CodePen. And so these are all, and I guess we could do, just for the sake of completion, we could do, and this is why you want to use a code editor, because you see at the very beginning when I get rid of the 6, it added it to the end tag as well. So it knows what you were doing. And as you can see here, these are the different 6, and there might be even H7, I'm not sure. No one, not used, rarely used if it is. These are all the different default headline sizes, and so that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about headlines and hierarchy, visual hierarchy, and informational architecture, as it were. This is a time when you definitely want to keep this in mind. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of that because that was just an example. I'm going to, let's see here. I'm going to start a paragraph, and let's see here. This is where some cool information, can't spell, would go. And then it would just, that would go on for quite a while. You want a paragraph out of that, and so I'll just copy and paste to take up some space. And yeah, it catches up. So I have my paragraph here. And let's say here, I'm going to do a little bit of inline style to show you what that looks like. And so I'm going to, and of course, inline style, you start with your starting tag, or if it's a void element, you just start with the tag itself. But H1 not being a void element, we'll go ahead and start with the opening tag. And let's say, I want to say there's going to be a style here. And as we saw earlier in the slide deck, this is how you would apply an inline style to an element. And so style, let's say color red. We'll go with that. And so we give it a second, and you can see that it updated, and now my headline is, I'm going to do that. There we go. You can see my headline is now in red. And I could also do, let's see here, FFOO. There's another way of doing it. And as you can see here, it also accepts hex value. And we could also, for that matter, do RGB. I actually don't know what, okay, so that would be 255.00, right? Because red, green, blue, right? Okay, there we go. And so, and I can also do HSV, for example, and you need to know your numbering system. And I won't get into, the different color attributes, sorry, the different color properties. I won't go through them all, but do know, as proven here, there are different ways to do color. And there are other, inline styles you could do as well. Like, for example, you could do, I don't know, font weight, 200, I think that's the, yeah, okay, that is the attribute. And you can see that there's a default font weight that's a lot, it's a much larger number, it's a lot bolder. But if I give it a font weight of 200, that's pretty light. And you can see here that the headline it became less bold, and this is almost normal or almost regular. And so, if I boost it up to like 900 and you give it a second, it'll make it significantly bolder. And there's limits to these things, of course, but and you could do you could put comma, and you could go on and keep on adding a lot of inline text. But I don't really want to do inline text, or I don't want to do, sorry, inline CSS. It's not my style. Not really into that. So what we'll do is we can come up to the head, our metadata section, and we can go ahead and do style, starting tag, and whoop, can't spell at all. Style ending tag, boom, like that. Let me get rid of some of the space here, make it clearer to what I'm doing here. Style. Okay, and so we see that the title element is a child of head, which is in turn a child of HTML, and so because they're on the same hierarchical level, title is a sibling of style. And as far as style is concerned, well, I don't want to do anything too intense, too different than what I've already done. And so for style, I'll create a selector, and so I want to just select every single headline of every single H1 element. And I'll start with curly braces, and you'll notice that when I typed, let's see that again. So I'm going to type the opening curly brace, and it automatically adds the ending for you. It knows what you're about to do, so it auto completes for you. Again, one of the many benefits of using a code editor is that it's going to save you time, and it's also going to prevent you from making mistakes. Like if you're just typing this in a plain text editor like Notepad or text editor, you might forget to write a closing or an ending curly brace, and that's going to cascade all the way down your HTML or your document, and so that's something you definitely want to avoid. Excuse me. And so we're going to need to give some attributes and some properties in here. And so color is pretty good. And so I'm going to say color blue. And if you give it a second, this should hopefully make that blue. Oh no, it didn't. Let's see here. Color. Do you like that? I forget, because sometimes CodePen's a bit wonky. Yeah, I didn't like it when it was in quotes. And so we give it the color of blue. And so, okay. Very cool. We're doing some internal CSS is what we're doing here, because it's in the HTML document. However, we're putting it in the style element in the metadata portion, that is to say the head element. And so I did mention earlier that we can do multiple styles with a single selector. And so if we want to do multiple styles, what we can't do is just hit enter and start writing another selector or another property, another attribute, and another property. So like if I want to say font weight, I don't know, like 300. It's reading this all together. So what the browser is reading is color blue font weight 300, and there's no stop. And so it thinks the way the browser is reading this, and it's sort of indicated. So what I'm saying is sort of backed up by the color here, is that the color the color is the attribute. It thinks the property that I'm setting is blue font weight. Well, no, it's just blue, and font weight's another attribute, and the property for font weight is 300. We need to separate these, and the way you separate them is, boom, semicolon. And you'll notice when I get rid of the semicolon, the color here changes for font weight. So color, the word color, that is to say the attribute. Attributes have their own specific coloration in CodePen, and we see that it's sort of this purple mauve color. I'm not sure exactly what that is. And so you might think, well, why aren't we seeing font weight? Font weight's an attribute. Why doesn't it have that color? Because again, this is bleeding into the next line. If we put a semicolon here, there we go. Now it sees that font weight is an attribute with its own property. And again, the very last property, if you have nothing past this, you don't necessarily need to put a semicolon. I do or do not. Just be consistent. It doesn't matter. Just you be consistent. That's the most important thing. And so it looks like we have two. And so that's cool. We have two different styles going on here. I changed the font weight and I changed the color with one selector in an internal CSS declaration. That's neat. Okay, but what about the third way of writing CSS? Well, that's the external CSS. Now, I could show you what that would look like on my using my computer, using my hard drive, because I do have a separate the portfolio I'm working on for my website. I have my CSS in its own CSS file, of course, and it's in a different directory because keep your things, name your directories properly and keep everything where it ought to be. And if those things have homes, different file types live in their own directories. However, I'm going to show you sort of a simulation of what that looks like. Good LaCroix. And so this CSS over here, this is going to simulate an external CSS file. And what I'm going to do is copy this selector here with its 2 attributes and 2 properties. I'm going to do Command X for cut, and I don't need style anymore. I don't need that element anymore in head because we're not doing anything with it. And so when I get rid of all that, this is the default. This is the default parameters, the default style that the browser has built into it. So I will go to CSS over here, and this is simulating an external CSS document. And unlike the HTML file, the CS file is only for CSS. You'll notice that I could put CSS here if I wanted to. I could add it in the metadata portion, that is to say the head element. I could do style/style and just put some CSS there, so there can be CSS inside your HTML document. Doesn't really work the opposite way. You don't have HTML in your CSS, and again, I'm speaking super broadly. But you don't have CSS you don't have HTML in your CSS file. You just have CSS, and so you might be tempted to write something like this. You don't need to. That's redundant. The browser knows it's a CSS. It's a .css file. It knows. It doesn't need to be told this is a style. And so there's no reason to write style. In fact, that would probably not even, that would probably make the file not work. Or may not, depending on different functionalities. But so you can all you need to do is just put the raw CSS in here. And you'll notice that when I put the CSS in here, I have the selector, I have the attribute color, and the property blue, attribute font weight, property 300. Well, okay, that's cool. Again, that's the third way of doing the same thing. But you'll notice, and this is why it's preferable. This is one of the ways it's preferable. Is sequestering of your languages. We have CSS in its own. This would be a separate document, its own .css file. This is its own .html. But for this website, it sort of puts them together, page by page, just so you can edit one or the other, which is sort of similar to what you would find in let's bump that font size back down, like VSC or a code editor, where you could have multiple tabs open up here. I only have one tab open at the time, but because I have the Explorer open on the side here, I could boom. Now I have a new tab open. I have an HTML file and a style.css, so I could make a lot of changes here. And I just did a mouse over by accident, but this is another reason why you might want to use a code editor, color picker, and you can change transparency and all sorts of good stuff right from the code editor. And so this makes it a lot easier. Again, time-saving techniques. And so this view right here, having your HTML right next to your CSS, is somewhat similar in a code editor, like having your HTML right next to your CSS, except for these would be, you'd be able to see both at the same time in any event. This is how we've gone through the 3 different ways of writing CSS. You have your inline, your internal. So inline, again, is inside the tag, inside your start tag, or if it's in the a void element, just in the tag itself, and not in the head because it wouldn't be metadata. It's just inline style. And then we have the internal method, which is writing your CSS in the style element, which is a child element of the head element, which is in turn a child element of the HTML. Again, I don't mean to make it sound as complicated as I'm making it. If you think of this kind of in terms of like what you see in Figma, there's children, and so there's parents and children. Think of like frames and objects inside of frames, and whether or not they're siblings or children of children of children, so on and so forth. It's just a way of conceptualizing how the structure looks. And and again, the second way of writing CSS is doing your internal, which is writing inside the style element, inside the body element, And so it becomes metadata. And so all that stuff that you wrote inside the style tag in the head is not rendered to the viewport because it's metadata, but it is read by the browser and applied to the HTML. And then the third type is external, which, as we can see here, this is a simulation of what external looks like. And if this is of interest to anyone, I can do another live stream about sort of more of a realistic production environment. And so I could write some, I would write a new HTML file, a new CSS file in VSC or Sublime, or maybe even Notepad, or sorry, TextEdit for OS X, save those locally and launch them in a browser so you can see what sort of the local development cycle looks like. And so, without using hosting or anything wild like that, because it's very simple, and I really hope that I'm not overcomplicating this. I'm trying to keep it as basic and as simple as I possibly can. And so again, this is the third way. This simulates the external. So you have your .css file, style.css, and then index.html. And I would get into why it's called index.html and whatnot, but I think that that's just slightly ever so much outside the scope of what I hope to accomplish for this video. And so what I hope is that, just to sort of wrap up here, my intent in making this live stream was to give you an indication of not only why I think HTML and CSS is important. If you don't know, I'm not necessarily asking you to learn CSS and be able to write CSS and HTML. At least recognize it when you see it, and hopefully be able to read it. It's like languages. You might be able to speak a language, or you might be able to understand a language, but you can't speak it. I'm sort of that way with Spanish. At least kind of know what you're looking at. You might not be able to write fresh HTML, fresh CSS, but if you look at it, if you're looking at this HTML over here, and you didn't see this portion down here, if all you saw was that, it would be maybe helpful in your design career to at least be able to come up with a mental idea of, like, a mental picture of what this looks like. You can imagine what this would render as in a browser, and without having to see this down here. And so even if you disagree with my reasoning, which is completely fine, I wanted to explain why I think it's important. And of course I wanted to give an example of I want to give an explanation of not only what CSS and HTML are, how they work together, and the dependencies thereof, but I also wanted to give sort of just a miniature markup example of how these things are. And so you'll notice that I didn't explain too much about tags, and I certainly could have written a lot more here. However, the idea is to either convince you to try to learn a little bit of HTML or CSS, or at least give you, at the very least, if you still have no inclination to try this out on your own. And again, I highly recommend using CodePen or JS Fiddle for that matter. At least I would like to give you maybe you come away with an idea of how, not how the web works, because that's something else entirely. At least how some of these technologies work and how they operate. And I truly believe that that's going to help you out when you're dealing with, like, dev teams, or when you're building your own web apps or things of that nature. You'll at least understand sort of how these things are interconnected. And before I say goodnight, I did just remember something that I spoke about earlier. And so I think I just very briefly mentioned something about Figma that you may not, or that you may have clicked by accident and not know what it was if you're not familiar with HTML and CSS. But as I said, Figma is a web app. Figma is built on web technologies, and this is what I'm about to show you is not proof of that, because this could have come out of, this program could be written in C++ and still have this feature. But we always talk about design and prototype. What about this third option? And you may have clicked on this and not know what it was, or you may have just ignored it the entire time you've been using Figma, or you might have used it a lot. I'm not sure. But in Figma, if you select a layer, we'll just save this little bit of text down here. There we go. I'll zoom in a bit here and go to Inspect. What you're looking at right here, this is CSS. This is what I wouldn't necessarily copy and paste this into a document, but if you want this look with all the styles I have given it. For example, this is the text has an alignment of center, which I wanted. If you look at inspect, let's see here, text align center. That's CSS. That's a style. You can copy that if you wanted to into your CSS document, and it would render this just fine. And so yeah, as we can see here, we have attributes and we have properties. And this is Figma out of the box. I didn't configure this. This is not a plugin. Figma is meant for a lot more than graphic developers or UX developers and prototypers. It's definitely a bridge between front end and back end, more than we're taught in certain education tracks, because some things just aren't necessary. It's for whatever reason it's determined not to be necessary. But this is the font. So yeah, the attribute is the font family. I am indeed using Outfit. Big fan of that font right now. Font style, normal. Font weight 400. We use font weight in the example. And so, see, CSS and HTML are a lot closer than you think. And if you did not know that inspect was right here and that it had all this information, you may have been, sort of in a roundabout way, as I said earlier, you're already kind of designing CSS. And so this is just happens to be what it would, how it would look, or what you would want to do to have it render like this in a browser. And so, more or less. And so I thought that was just very cool to point out. And so that is it for this stream. I certainly had no intention of making it this long, but if you stuck around with me this far, I do highly appreciate it. And of course, if you have any questions or any concerns, or if I confuse you, which my manner of speaking and presenting, I'm sure I did at some point, go ahead and reach out to me. I'm on Slack, of course, the regular channels. You know where to find me. And of course, I'm also on Skype these days. And feel free, of course, if you want to subscribe to me on Twitch, and you can sign up for notifications, and you'll receive a reminder as to when I'm going live. And I'm sort of settling into a Tuesday evening, Friday evening sort of frequency, and it's usually about 7:30, but that's not in stone as of yet. Of course, now you can see the lamp in the shot. I want to, I'm getting everything set up for a more professional experience stream-wise. Better lighting is coming soon. I have a good camera at this point. I moved the desk around, and so we're improving all the time. And so I appreciate everyone helping out with this. And of course, just reach out to me if you need anything, and have a wonderful weekend. I will see you next week.